Ever looked at a sick plant and wondered what's really going on in there? For thousands of years, we blamed everything from angry gods to bad luck. But how did we get from that to understanding this incredibly complex world of tiny, microscopic pathogens? Well, that's what this explainer is all about. We're going to dive into the fascinating history of plant diseases. So let's start with the big question. Why do plants get sick? Seems simple, right? But believe it or not, the answer was a complete mystery for thousands of years. And really, this one question is the heart of our whole story today, as we trace this incredible journey from pure superstition all the way to modern science. All right, so let's jump in. Our story starts way, way back in the ancient world. If you look at the earliest European and Vedic texts, you can find the first clues about how people were trying to make sense of all the blights, the rusts, and the wilts that were just devastating their crops. So our first stop is ancient Greece with a guy named Theophrastus. You might have heard of him. He's known as the father of botany, and for good reason. He was one of the very first people to actually systematically write down his observations about what was making plants sick. And we're talking way back, around 300 B.C. So in his book, which was called Inquiry into Plants, his whole method was just looking and writing down what he saw. No experiments, just pure observation. Now, he got some things right. He noticed that, different plants get different diseases. But here's the kicker. He believed these diseases were totally spontaneous. Like, they just popped up from inside the plant itself, with absolutely no cause from the outside world. Okay, so while Theophrastus is doing his thing in Greece, a completely different and frankly amazing set of ideas was bubbling up over in ancient India. If you dig into ancient texts like the Rig Veda and the Atharva Veda, you'll find some pretty remarkable stuff about plant diseases. Get this, the Rig Veda actually talked about a kind of germ theory, the idea that diseases were caused by microorganisms. I mean, this is a concept that Europe wouldn't even begin to accept for thousands of years. And then you have the Vrikshayurveda by a scholar named Surapala, who went even further. He sorted diseases into two camps, internal and external. And he linked the external ones to microbes and insects. He even wrote down specific treatments. For that time, this was absolutely revolutionary thinking. But back in Europe, after Theophrastus, things just stopped. For 2,000 years, scientific progress on plant diseases basically hit a wall. It became this age of superstition. If your crops failed, you blamed angry gods, the wrath of God, maybe even the stars. It got so serious that the Romans had a yearly festival, the Robigalia, where they tried to appease Robigo, the god of rust, just hoping he'd leave their wheat alone. So things were stuck in that rut for a long, long time. It wasn't until the early 1700s that the tide finally started to turn, and science began to push back against superstition. And this next huge leap forward? It was all thanks to one person who decided to take a really close look at the world of fungi. So let's introduce our next hero, an Italian botanist named Pier Antonio Micheli. Today, we call him the father of mycology, the study of fungi. And trust me, his work was an absolute game changer. Okay, so what did he do that was so special? Well, Micheli was the first person to actually point a microscope at fungi and see their spores. But he didn't stop there. He did this brilliant experiment where he took those tiny little spores, put them on some fruit, and then watched as they grew into new fungi. He wrote all about it in his 1729 book, describing all these different fungal parts and proving for the first time that fungi actually reproduce. They weren't just some random gunk that appeared out of nowhere. So you'd think everyone would be like, wow, amazing discovery, right? Nope, not at all. So why didn't his work catch on right away? Well, the big idea at the time was something called the theory of spontaneous generation. Most scientists genuinely believed that living things like microorganisms could just appear out of non-living stuff. Like how mold seems to just show up on old bread. So Micheli's idea that fungi grew from these specific tiny spores was just too wild, too radical for most people to even consider. So Micheli kind of planted the seed of the idea, if you'll pardon the pun. But it was going to take some really careful, well-planned experiments to prove the next big step, that these little microorganisms weren't just found on sick plants, but that they were the actual cause of the sickness. And that brings us to our next key player, a French scientist named Mathieu Tillet. He decided to tackle this really nasty wheat disease, which had a couple of great names, bunt or stinking smut. Okay, so in 1755, Tillet lays out his findings. Through some really clever experiments, he shows that if you take seeds and coat them with the black dusty powder from a sick plant, you get way more sick plants in the next generation. Boom! He proved the disease was infectious. But he got one little thing wrong. He thought it was some kind of toxin or poison in the powder causing the problem. He didn't realize the powder was the cause. It was millions of tiny fungal spores. Still, he did figure out that you could treat the seeds with salt and lime to help stop the disease, which was a huge... All right, so Tillich got us most of the way there, but it was another scientist, Benedict Prevost, who took that final critical step. Prevost was the one who actually proved once and for all that a microorganism causes the disease. He identified the specific fungus called Tilletia caries as the bad guy behind wheat bunt. He literally watched its spores sprout and grow under his microscope and mapped out its whole life cycle. And here's the best part. He figured out that if you treated the seeds with copper sulfate, the spores couldn't germinate. He found a chemical cure. Okay, so by this point, we know that fungi are a huge deal, and they cause diseases. But the science was still a bit of a mess. It was just this jumble of different names and descriptions from all over. The next big job? Someone had to create a proper system for organizing and classifying all these new fungi. And two guys really stepped up to the plate here. First, there was Christian Hendrik Persson. In 1801, he published a system for naming rusts and smuts. Then there was Elias Magnus Fries, who did the same thing for a different big group of fungi. What they did together was bring in the binomial system of nomenclature, the two-part Latin names. It's the exact same system we still use to name species today. So you've got Michelli's early observations, you've got Tillich and Prevost proving fungi cause disease, you've got Persson and Fries creating a naming system. All of this incredible work was leading up to one person, a guy who would take all these pieces and build the entire foundation for modern plant pathology. And that man's name was Anton de Bary. You really can't overstate his importance. He took all these scattered bits of knowledge from everyone who came before him and pulled them all together into one single, coherent experimental science. I mean, de Bary's list of accomplishments is just staggering. He's the one who figured out the cause of the Irish potato famine, and he named the organism Phytophthora infestans. Then, in 1865, he made this mind-blowing discovery that some rust fungi are heteroecious, which means they need two totally different plants to finish their life cycle. He also mapped out the crazy lives of downy mildews. Oh, and as if that wasn't enough, he was the first person to figure out that lichens aren't a single organism at all, but a fungus and an alga living together. He even invented the word for it, symbiosis. He wrote a book in 1866 that basically became the Bible for the whole field. He was the first to explain how fungi do their damage by releasing enzymes and toxins that literally dissolve plant tissues. But maybe his biggest legacy was as a teacher. His lab was like a magnet for aspiring scientists. He trained a whole generation of the world's best plant pathologists, who then went out and took this brand new science to every corner of the globe. Okay, so as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of history, I want to quickly break down a couple of key ideas that came out of this era. These are concepts that are still absolutely fundamental to plant pathology today. First, let's go back to that heteroecious rust thing that de Bary discovered. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty cool. All it means is that the fungus needs two totally different, unrelated plants to complete its life cycle. The classic example is the stem rust of wheat, Puccinia graminis. It has to spend part of its life on a wheat plant and another part of its life on a completely different plant, the common barberry. If you take away one of those plants, the fungus just can't complete its cycle. It's broken. And this leads us to two terms that people mix up all the time, alternate host and collateral host. So an alternate host, like the barberry for our wheat rust, is from a totally different plant family, and the pathogen has to have it to finish its life cycle. It's absolutely essential. Think of it like a mandatory layover on a long flight. A collateral host, though, is different. It's usually in the same family as the main host plant. The pathogen can hang out on it and survive, but it's not essential to its life cycle. It's more of a plan B, a backup host. And knowing the difference between these two is absolutely crucial if you're trying to control a plant disease. So look how far we've come. From blaming angry gods for some rust on your wheat, all the way to understanding the beautiful, complex dance of symbiosis. Our knowledge has just exploded. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other invisible, microscopic battles are happening right now, out in the fields and the forest all around us, shaping the future of our food and maybe even our entire planet?